Today I want to talk to you about the different levels of sampling and walk you through the beginner, advanced, and expert level sampling techniques and how to do them. Now first, I want to say that the techniques that I use in this video are valid no matter what skill level you're at. I routinely use beginner techniques when making beats, and so if you do too, that's not a bad thing. Always do what's best for the music, even if that means that you don't get to show off the fancy skills and techniques that you've learned. Alright, so let's start off with the beginner sampling techniques. The most basic one that you can use when you're trying to make a beat using a sample is looping. This is when you find a short segment of your entire sample and you just play that segment over and over again. It sounds simple, but there are some really helpful and important ideas that you need to know, which I will cover. So start off by looking at this sample here. This is one that I found off of Vinyl Frontier, which is a great resource on YouTube for finding samples. And as you can see, I put it into the FL Studio playlist. Now the first thing that you're going to want to do to loop is to find a part of the sample that actually sounds good when it's repeating over and over again. Typically, this will be a sort of longer phrase that works when repeated. So let's take a listen to what we have here. So this section here sounds a bit better to me, and I actually think I found a part of the sample that would work if I were to just loop it over and over again. So I'm going to see if this would work by grabbing my knife tool and just isolating that one little segment there. So I'm going to make my cut right here. And at the back part as well. And at this point, I'm just going to delete everything that I don't need and then just drag this all the way to the beginning of the playlist. Now currently the project BPM is set to the default of 140, which is not going to work with this sample. If I were to take a listen to the sample playing with the metronome on, so it's a bit off here. So what I'm going to do is use the BPM counter and just click along with the sample. I'm going to nod my head to get a feeling of the rhythm of the loop and then just click every single time I hear a beat. And hopefully that gets me to a closer BPM that would work with this loop. Alright, so apparently 78 BPM would work better. Let's go ahead and turn the metronome on and just take a listen again. So that sounds much better, and looking at what I've cut, I actually have a bit more of the sample that I actually need. As you can see, this is a 1-bar loop, but I actually have a little bit more right here. So let's go ahead and truncate this end part and see if it sounds good when it's actually looping. So as you can see, what I'm trying to do here is get this loop to fit perfectly on grid so it actually loops around seamlessly. As of right now, I think this works pretty well. Right now the BPM of the beat is 78, but I feel like I want the beat itself to be a bit more up-tempo, so I'm going to bring it up to 81. But as you can see, as soon as I start playing around with the BPM, the loop itself changes its length. So what I'm going to do is double-click on the sample here and change the mode to stretch. And now what happens when I change my BPM is the sample length stays the same. So that sounds cool so far. Now when you're looping, you can also do a variety of simple techniques like stretching and pitch shifting. For example, if I were to double click on the sample and bring it down 500 semitones, we have a pitch down version of the sample now. Also, if I trigger the stretch feature up here and I stretch this over a longer period of time, we now have the sample playing over twice the length. This can be helpful if you just want your sample to fit in a very particular space, but I actually like the sample better when it was just a 1-bar loop, so I'll bring it back here. And by the way, I also want to mention that if you take your loop and you notice the timing of the sample is a bit off, you can see if I were to zoom in on the sample, we have this pluck string hitting here a tiny bit late. It's not flush with this grid line right here. Now this might not necessarily be a bad thing. Having these types of imperfections can make for an interesting sample, but I could definitely adjust this if I wanted to. Here I'm using New Time. If you don't know how to use this, I really recommend watching the video I made a while back on getting started with sampling, where I cover how to use this tool. And this can be really helpful for very particular situations like this one here. If I want to take this pluck and have it be flush on the grid, I can just drag it over easily like so, and change other ones as well if I wanted to. Anyways, we have our loop set. It's sounding great. Now it's time to just go ahead and build around this loop and maybe add some effects onto it, just so it sounds a bit better. Alright, so that's the core idea of this beat built. That's how to sample at a beginner level. Next, let's move on to intermediate level sampling. For the beginner level, what we just did was that we found a big segment within our sample and we played it over and over again. For the intermediate level, instead of finding one big piece of our sample, we're just going to find multiple smaller pieces and sort of rearrange those pieces to play something else. Now we definitely could do this from the playlist. We could just grab our knife and start making chops all over the place. And then we could take our pieces and start to try to move them around and rearrange them like so. Having said that, I would argue that this isn't the most efficient and effective way of sampling at this level. The reason being is because it becomes far more difficult to experiment and try out different ideas. There's just a lot of dragging and dropping in order to preview what you have. And there's just better ways of doing this, like using a sampler, for example. Ones that come with FL Studio are SliceX and Fruity Slicer. I have a full tutorial on how to use SliceX if you're interested. A free option that I used in the past was Momentum, that has a few additional features. Personally, I use Serato Sample currently, but for the sake of this tutorial, since many of you are probably using SliceX, I'll just use that. So let's go ahead and throw our sample into our sampler. And with most samplers, they will give you an option to create slices or chops with your sample. So I'm going to go ahead and create a bunch of slices and see if I can come up with my own creation. A good place to start if you're new to sampling is to just put your slices on these larger transients like you see here. Basically what I'm doing here is I'm chopping on different notes throughout the sample, which will allow me to more easily create something musical. Now this isn't the only way you have to chop or slice up your sample, but it's just what I'm doing here. And this part usually takes some experimenting, but I think I have a loop that makes sense using a handful of these pieces from this sample here. Alright, so this sounds cool. Now just like what we did with our beginner level sampling, we can also use the same techniques here if we wanted. If you remember, what we did was we stretched and repitched our loop in order to fit what we were making. We can do this exact same thing at an intermediate level as well, but with the individual chops instead. Meaning we can take any of these chops that I've used here and repitch them and stretch them if need be. That's actually exactly what I did in order to get this chop right here to fit better. This is how it originally sounded. As you can hear, this chop didn't really fit well rhythmically, so in order to get this slice to fit better, I took this one very specific chop and I stretched it out so it was far slower. And as you can see inside this menu in SliceX, we have these abilities like we had with our beginner level sampling. We have the ability to repitch right up here. We can also stretch using the time multiplier knob, and that's exactly what I did. I basically stretched this out so it's a little bit longer and it actually fits with what I'm trying to build. You can hear it's actually playing the exact same thing but just slower, so it actually fits. You can hear after I stretched it out, that piece just fits a lot better. So as you can see, the same techniques are still at our disposal when we're doing intermediate level sampling. We're just doing them at a more finite level within our individual chops. And just like with the last example, let's go ahead and start adding our typical elements into this beat, like our drums and bass and whatnot. And one thing that you may notice here is that I actually ended up using yet another sample in this beat as well. I have this drum break from the guys at Beat Batter that I ended up using, and I just brought it into Fruity Slicer. I typically use Fruity Slicer more so for my drum breaks just because it does a pretty good job of detecting your slices automatically using these adjustable dials right down here. And just like with our last example, if I wanted to, I could easily build my own drum pattern in this exact same way by moving around these pieces in this drum sample and just creating my own rhythm. It's the exact same technique. So that is the intermediate level where we take our sample and we split it up into smaller pieces and we begin playing around with the timing of each of these pieces. And the final level is the advanced level. Again, just like our last example, the ideas that we've learned so far apply to this exact same level of sampling as well. We will be breaking our sample into smaller little pieces and we can pitch shift and stretch them out and rearrange the timing of these pieces to play what we want them to. But the difference here is that not only will we be playing with the timing of our pieces, but also the spaces of these pieces. So before we were manipulating our sample only in terms of the timing, but this time we're also going to be manipulating our frequencies and the depth and the stereo qualities of our sample as well. So let's take a look at this example here. Once again, I'm going to start by chopping my sample into smaller pieces and find the different pieces that I like to create a musical loop, just like I have showed so far. Now what I'm going to try to do is to take yet another part of the sample and layer it on top of this. So I'll duplicate my sampler in order to create yet another layer. But first I want to manipulate the space that the sample sits in. I'm going to go ahead and reduce some of the frequencies as well as add some reverb to really push it back. And now to program this into the beat. And notice, just like I mentioned before, we can still use the same techniques from the last two levels. Here what I did was I stretched this one piece out so it fits in. You can see it says right here, time stretch, -14%. And I also repitched it. You can see up here, -6 semitones. So let's go ahead and create yet another layer. I'm going to go ahead and duplicate this once again. But this time I'm going to go ahead and repitch the sample up 6 semitones, again using the techniques that we've already learned. This time I'm going to play around with the different space that this layer sits in. I'm going to open up an EQ once again and really limit what frequencies this sound sits in. And as you can see, I also added some padding effects to play with the stereo space and just come up with a very small layer here since we're already starting to run out of room with this loop. So I hope you're getting a feel for what we're going for when it comes to advanced sampling. We're no longer looking at the sample as a stagnant piece of music. We can begin to really take it apart at a very small level and create what we want. And that's exactly what advanced sampling is, taking your sample apart at a smaller and smaller level and manipulating these small parts with different types of tools to create a finalized idea. So once again, let's turn this into a beat. There we go, we got a full beat on our hands. So those are the different levels of sampling, and again, I want to reiterate that just because you can do advanced level techniques doesn't mean you should do them every single time. There's always going to be a time and a place to get a lot more simple and straightforward with your techniques. Do what's best to produce the best possible song in the end, because no one really cares what techniques you use to get there. And if you enjoyed this video, like and subscribe. Head over to betterbeatmaker.com if you want some advanced help with your production. The link to my free drum kit's available in the description box below, as well as a link to the Discord to join my producer community. And I'll see you guys next time.